time convincing most Americans that we're not still in a recession. Depressions are different than recessions. The technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP with rising unemployment, a couple other bells and whistles, little subjective factors, but that's basically it. So people, when you say depression, they're like, depression sounds worse than a recession. And if recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, then a depression must be like 10 quarters of declining GDP, because it's got to be worse. But that's not the definition. The definition of a depression, you can have growth in a depression, but it's below trend growth. In other words, if trend is 3.5, and you're actually banging out 1.5, 2, that gap between, let's say, 1.5 and 3.5% growth, that's depressed growth. It's an output gap. It compounds over time, and you never get it back. We are losing trillions of dollars of wealth. We are impoverishing future generations on a relative basis because of our inability to get back to trend growth. So the reason American people feel this and don't listen to the economists, and they're right, is because we're in a depression. So leaving that aside, the Fed at least understands the business cycle and the fact that the next recession, they say they don't die of old age, but they do die, and we're getting closer to the next one. So they are in a desperate race to get rates up to 3.5% before the next recession hits, so they can cut them to get out of the recession. The question is, can you raise rates enough to cure the next recession without causing the recession you're preparing to cure? That's the dilemma. That's the finesse. My answer is no, they're not going to be able to do it, but they think they can. Why are they in this box? Well, because Bernanke should have raised rates in 2010, 2011, in the early stages of the expansion, when the economy would have been much better able to bear it than it is now. Bernanke skipped a whole cycle. He skipped a whole rate increase cycle to pursue these wacky experiments and, QE and zero interest rate policy and all that. I spoke to Bernanke about this, and he used the word experiment. He said this was an experiment. Bernanke made his academic reputation by studying the Great Depression, in the wake of Friedman and Anna Schwartz and some others. But he was a great scholar of the Great Depression, and he got his chance to kind of try out his theories. But what he told me was, he said 30 years from now, some new Ben Bernanke, some young scholar, will look back and tell us if we did a good job or not. We actually don't know right now. See, the Great Depression was really 2 technical recessions, 29 to 33, and then 1937, 38. But from 33 to 37, we had an expansion, but the whole thing was a depression because we never got out of it. The stock market recovered the 1929 high in 1954. It was a long time to get back to even. But Bernanke's mantra was, doing something is better than doing nothing. I completely disagree. It's better to do nothing if you don't know what you're doing. And this is really the monetary equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors say, first rule of being a doctor is first do no harm. Anyway, bottom line is, by pursuing QE and zero interest rate policy, Bernanke failed to raise rates during the early stages of a cyclical expansion, which he should have done. If he had, the economy would have been just fine, and we'd be able to cut them today, but he didn't. So Janet Yellen now has to make up for lost time. So that's the mission. But again, and this is what the market completely does not get, and the Wall Street economists don't get. Nobody gets this, because they see the Fed raising rates, and they've done the correlations and the regressions back to World War II, and they go, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. So if the Fed's raising rates, the economy must be getting stronger, so bid up stock prices, et cetera. But that's like saying umbrellas cause rain. In other words, they've got the causality backwards. The Fed never leads the economy, ever. The Fed follows the economy. So a normal business cycle looks like this. So you get a little expansion going, and unemployment starts to go down, and industrial capacity utilization starts to go up, and inflation starts to go up, and the Fed's watching, and then it keeps going. They go, it's getting a little hot, we better raise rates, and they raise rates, but of course they started too late. The expansion keeps going, inflation keeps going up, unemployment keeps going down. Then the economy starts to cool down, unemployment goes up, and then prices go down, and capacity utilization drops, and we get into recession, we better cut. And then they cut, and then you hit the bottom, and then you come out of it again. So think of that as like a nice, pretty sine wave, right? That's a business expansion, business contraction over and over, 30 or so times since the end of World War II, with the Fed always following the economy, never leading the economy. So all the big brains on Wall Street, they've got all this data, and they say, well, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. That has absolutely been true for 30 times since the end of World War II. It is not true today. The reason it's not true today is because Bernanke skipped a cycle and they're playing catch up. For the first time since 1937, the Fed is tightening into weakness. That is a key thing to bear in mind. The Fed is tightening into weakness. They are not leading the economy to strength. They are not responding to strength, even though Wall Street thinks they are. And there's a great danger that they're actually going to cause the recession they're preparing to cure, as I mentioned. The Fed will raise rates 25 basis points 4 times a year from now until the middle of 2019, until they get them to 3.25%. So like clockwork, every March, June, September, December, for 2017, 2018, into 2019, look for a Fed rate hike until they get to 3.25%, at which point they'll be able to say, all right, now we're 3.25. If we have a recession tomorrow, we can cut them back down to 0 again and get out of it. That'll be mission accomplished. Now, this is why I was sitting there in December like, yep, they're going to raise them in March. And right now, I'll tell your listeners they're going to raise them in June. There's your Fed response function. There's your baseline scenario. What are the exceptions to Fed rate hike? And under what conditions will they not raise rates? Because everything I just described to you, they've had in mind since March 2015 when Yellen took patience out of the statement. That was the end of forward guidance. And by the way, if you go back to 2015, I said they're not going to raise rates all year, and they weren't going to do the liftoff that people were looking for in March, June, September, and they didn't lift off in September because the Chinese rate exchange devaluation, the stock market fell out of bed August 2015. Finally, they raised them in December 2015, and Wall Street was ready for March. I said no, in June, no, September, no. It wasn't until December 2016 that they raised them the second time. So obviously, there are conditions under which they don't raise rates, notwithstanding the baseline scenario. So what are those conditions? There are 3. Well, 4 actually. So if you see job creation below 75,000, that will cause them to pause. By the way, pause is the key word. If you go home through the speeches, you'll see the word pause in Dudley's recent remarks. Pause is the Fed's jargon for we're not going to raise rates. We got the Jim scenario, which I took from the Fed. It's their scenario. Or a technical recession. So, we're going to know Friday what the first quarter GDP is. It's pretty close to negative, but I'm not saying we're in a recession now. We might be. But if you see a recession, they'll pause. You see job creation below 75,000, they'll pause. By the way, that's a very low bar. If you see a jobs report, see, this is the other thing that confuses Wall Street. You see a jobs report with 100,000 jobs. So Wall Street goes, oh, that report's really weak. The Fed's going to think twice. No, 75,000 is the number. Yellen told us that. It was in one of her speeches. You just have to be a geek like me and read all the speeches. So the third factor would be disinflation. So the Fed has this 2% inflation target. They've missed it for 6 years. They're finally getting close to hitting it. By the way, I think the listeners know they use the PCE core deflator year over year. There's PPI and CPI and core, a bunch of inflation indices, but we know what they use. PCE core deflator year over year. That actually has been getting close to 2%. But if you see it turn around, if you see that gap down to like 1.5, 1.4, 1.3, then they will pause. The last condition for the pause is a disorderly decline in stock markets more than 5%. If you see a 6, 7, 8% decline, so if the S&P went down 100 points, Fed doesn't care. Dow Jones goes down 1,000 points, Fed doesn't care. But beyond that, if you see the S&P start to go down 150 or the Dow start to go down 1,500 points in a disorderly way, it looks a little scary. It looks like there's no bottom. It looks like if you see that, they'll pause. So the Fed's going to raise like clockwork 4 times a year for the next 2.5 years, unless you see job creation below 75,000, disinflation, a technical recession. If you don't see one of those things, they're going to raise rates. And so right now, I don't see any of them. I mean, they could all happen, but it looks like, growth is going to be positive. Job creation's been decent, over 100,000. Disinflation is probably coming, but not quite here yet, and they'll want to see a couple months in a row. And the stock market's not crashing. So none of the pause conditions are in place. Therefore, they will raise rates. Simple.
Debt can be managed if you have enough growth, but we don't have enough growth anywhere in the world. The U.S. is growing the strongest, but only about 2%. Europe is growing around 1%, barely. Japan has actually been in and out of recession multiple times. China has a higher growth rate, but they actually manipulate a lot of their data. A lot of their growth is from investment, which is wasted. So if you discount for that, their growth is a lot lower. So the whole world has too much debt, not enough growth. That's the problem that the financial elites are trying to solve. Well, debt is not automatically a problem, subject to several conditions. If you borrow money and you put it to productive use so that the profit from the investment is more than enough to pay the interest, and if you're growing fast enough to afford the debt, then it's manageable. But that's not the situation in the world today. The problem in the world today is that a lot of debt is being incurred, the money's being wasted, and we don't have enough growth to pay off the debt. So this mountain of debt is getting larger and larger relative to the productive capacity of the economy. So again, if you can afford the debt and put it to good use, that's one thing, but that's not the world today. We're wasting the money and we cannot afford to pay it back. Well, once you're in the situation we described, there are only three ways out. One is growth, we talked about, but we don't have the growth. The other one is outright default, just don't pay it, which would cause a global financial catastrophe. We all know that. But as long as you can print the money, there's no reason to default. The third way out, and the one that the elites prefer, this is the global elite secret plan, is inflation. They have to have inflation. Basically make the currency worthless. So I can say if I owe you $1 trillion, Simone, here's your $1 trillion. Good luck buying a loaf of bread because I printed the money and it's not worth very much. That's the secret plan. The question is, how do you do it? So we said that the elite plan is to have inflation. They have to have inflation. But the question is, how do you get inflation? I call this the problem of Jaggernomics in honor of Mick Jagger, member of the Rolling Stones band. They had a song, "You Can't Always Get What You Want." So the problem today is central banks want inflation, but they can't get it. But by money printing, forward guidance, other market manipulations, they have not been able to get the inflation they want. So now the global elites are saying, okay, monetary policy will not solve the problem. Monetary policy alone will not give us the inflation we want. So we have to try something else. And the question is, what is the something else? There are a number of plans. One of them is negative interest rates. And the idea is, so normally you put your money in the bank and you earn some interest. The bank pays you money. With negative interest rates, you put your money in the bank and they take your money away. Now this is designed to get you to spend it. The idea is, well, if Simone knows I'm going to take her money away, she'll go spend it rather than sit there and let it be taken away. But this is a typical financial elite plan. They don't understand real world behavior. They don't understand how people actually think. What people do is they say, well, if you're going to have a negative interest rate, you're going to take my money away, I have to save more in order to meet my goals, whether it's buy a house or pay for my children's education. So people actually end up saving more. They also say to themselves, what signal are the central banks sending with negative interest rates? They must be worried about deflation. Deflation means lower prices, so people say, well, I'm not going to spend it, I'll wait till prices drop and then buy something later at a cheaper price. So negative interest rates are designed to encourage spending, but they actually have the opposite effect. They encourage more savings and less spending. Very typical of these elite plans. They dream up these ideas, but they don't work in the real world. The second thing they're thinking about doing is called helicopter money. And this goes back to a speech that Milton Friedman gave decades ago. And he said, well, look, central banks can always cause inflation. All they have to do is print money, push it out of helicopters. People will run around, scoop it up, and take the money and spend it. But the question is, how do they actually do it? What do they mean by helicopter money? What they mean is you're combining fiscal policy and monetary policy. So on the fiscal side, governments will spend the money. See, the problem is people don't want to spend. They're fearful. They want to save more, spend less, de-lever their balance sheets, not take as much risk. But government's very good at spending money. You would run larger deficits, have more government spending. Could be on whatever you want. It doesn't matter as long as you spend the money. It could be infrastructure, it could be defense, could be social welfare programs, benefits, medical, etc. Whatever it is. The government spends the money. This means larger deficits. How do you cover the deficits? Government borrowing. How do you issue the debt? The central banks print the money and buy the debt. So basically you have the government and the central bank working together to spend more money and then issue more debt and then print the money to buy the debt. So that's what helicopter money is. This is very likely to be inflationary. There are two other ways that the elites are trying to get inflation, if they have to. One would be through the IMF to issue SDRs, which are special drawing rights. I think in French it's DTS. It's a special drawing right from the IMF. This is money from thin air. This is world money, because the European Central Bank can print euros. The Federal Reserve can print dollars. Well, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they can print SDRs. They can print their own money, hand it out to their members, and then that money can be spent. So that's another way to do it. And then the fourth way to do it, and this is the most, this is the last resort, not something they want to do, would be to arbitrarily raise the price of gold. So a central bank could come along and say, you know what, as of today, the price of gold is going to be 5,000 euros per ounce. Just declare that. And then you would say, if you think that price is too high, sell us your gold, we'll buy it, we'll print money and buy it. If you think it's too low, come and get it, we'll sell you the gold. And in Europe, Germany and France and Italy and the European Central Bank have a lot of gold. The United States has 8,000 tons of gold. Europe has over 10,000 tons of gold. So if you say, okay, so the price of gold is 5,000 euros, I'm a buyer at 49.95, I'm a seller at 50.50. So you make a market, I'll use actual government gold to back up the market, then gold is 5,000 euros per ounce. Now the point is, nothing happens in isolation. If you have 5,000 euro per ounce gold, it also means the price of oil, the price of copper, wheat, steel, cotton, everything else, wages would go up as well. So it would cause inflation. So you basically have four ways to get inflation: negative interest rates, helicopter money, SDRs, and raising the price of gold. They may go to all four. They may try them one at a time and end up with a higher price of gold. But here's the thing, Simone. All of them mean a higher price of gold. It doesn't matter how you get the inflation. Once the inflation comes, the price of gold is going to go up. Just to kind of summarize and wrap up everything we've said, there's too much debt, not enough growth. The solution is inflation. But the question, the problem the world is facing, how do you get the inflation? And we've outlined the ways. The first is negative interest rates, which means a war on cash. Second is helicopter money. The third are the special drawing rights, just world money. And of course, the fourth way is to raise the price of gold. That will be the last resort, but those are the four ways. All of them are inflationary. All of them mean a higher price for gold. Well, that's right, Simone. We talked about this global elite plan for world inflation and how they're going to get there. We've gone through that in a lot of detail. But that's just part of an even bigger plan. What they want is world inflation, world money, world taxation, and a world central bank, which will be the IMF. So the IMF will be the central bank of the world issuing money. That'll make dollars and euros much less valuable because the SDR will be the new global currency at that point, of course, which is highly inflationary, which we talked about. And then finally, who controls the IMF, the central bank of the world? They have an executive committee, but it's really the G20. So I think of the G20, which are the largest developed economies and emerging markets such as Russia and China and Brazil and a few others. The G20 are the board of directors for world control. Simone, it may be too late for small savers to stop this elite plan. They may not be able to do anything about it, but it's not too late for them to protect their own net worth. They can do that. My first recommendation is investing 10% of your investable assets in gold, physical gold. So not gold futures or gold options or other gold paper products, as we call them, but actual physical gold kept in non-bank storage in a safe place. Not 50%, not 100%. You should never go all in, but I recommend 10%. That's enough to preserve wealth if everything else falls apart. For the rest of your portfolio, there are a number of things you can do. I actually recommend some cash. You might not want cash for long, but temporarily it'll reduce volatility, and you can use the cash to buy more gold when the time comes. And then also some private investments and in growth areas, technology, natural resources, hard assets. So there is a model portfolio that we recommend, but it starts with 10% gold. Vladimir Putin has a 6,000-member cyber brigade. They work day and night to penetrate Western financial systems in Europe and the United States. They can completely wipe out your digital wealth. It would be gone and you would never know it.
This banking crisis is far from over. All the dominoes never fall at once. They fall sequentially, and sometimes there are time gaps between them, and everyone says, oh, all good. It's not all good. You have to look behind the curtain of the international monetary system, understand what's actually going on. These failures are symptoms more so than the real problem. The real problem has to do with tight money. Interest rates are 5%. They're going to be, 5.25%. But that is a year or just over a year ago, March 2022, they were zero. So you go from 0 to 5.25% in about 1 year. That's extraordinary. I mean, people remember Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 20%, and he did. But that played out over a couple of years. This is 5% in 1 year, and the Fed's not done. I mean, they're saying we're going to think about it. We want to look at more data, but they have not said we're done. This whole pivot narrative has been wrong for a year, and it's wrong now.
This banking crisis is far from over. What a great news to start our day, eh? Jim Rickards said that the banks will never fail all at once. You have to be cognizant of the situation, like the market condition, public confidence, and of course, the interest rates. One of the easiest indicators of a healthy economy is the interest rates. If the economy is in a red-hot inflation, then the Fed has to raise interest rates in order to cool down spending and encourage the public to save money because they will earn more interest with their bank. The Fed has raised interest rates from 0.5% to 5.33% in just 1 year, the fastest and highest in the history of Federal Reserve. But the inflation hasn't come down yet, so the Fed has to keep raising the interest rates. This whole pivot narrative has been wrong for over a year, Jim Rickards said. The Fed will never do a pivot. Pivot means stop raising the interest rate and instead start cutting it down. The Fed will keep raising the interest rates until they bring inflation down. A good bank risk manager will think, the Fed is raising the interest rates, it means the bond price is going down. I think I should sell my bonds so that all of my bank deposits will not lose any value because of the bond prices going down. But instead these bank managers do the opposite, so people will take their money from the bank. Jim Rickards said it will be worse than the 2008 global financial crisis. Let's hear more from Jim.
So we have tight money, we have underwater bonds, we have bank management who don't know the first thing about risk management. If you knew anything about risk management, once the Fed said, hey, we're gonna raise rates until we kill inflation. And that is what they said. Jay Powell gave 8 speeches between the summer of 2022 and recently, and he said that every single time. Well, if you're a bank risk manager and you hear that, you're like, I got bonds, interest rates go up, bond prices go down. I understand they're unrealized losses unless I sell them if they're in what's called a hold to maturity account, but they're still losses, and it still destroys confidence. Now, bank bonds today, you don't have to line up around the corner in the rain, with your hat on, waiting to see the teller. You can just do it with your iPhone, and to the tune of you can move $1 billion with your iPhone if you with the right accounts and passwords and all that. And so that's what happens. So the bank bonds are instantaneous. And they're far from over. So, yes, a little, kind of in a quiet period, but there'll be more. And the good analog, Matt, is the 2008 financial crisis. Everyone remembers, September 15th, 2008, midnight on a Sunday, Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy. And that's true. But that started in the spring of 2007. When HSBC reported disappointing earnings based on mortgage losses, and then came to a head in August. 2 Bear Stearns hedge funds failed. There were high yield mortgage funds. At the end of July, August, the Fed raised the discount rate. It took a full year, another 13 months, to get to Lehman Brothers. And what happened along the way? Bear Stearns in March 2008. Fannie Mae went bankrupt in June 2008. Freddie Mac bankrupt in June 2008. Congress bailed out the system in August 2008, and then Lehman Brothers. So that took a year and a half, and there are a lot of crises like that. So we're in falling dominoes. It's not over. It'll get a lot worse, and people should prepare for that. But as usual, they don't. People are very complacent. Wall Street says it's all good, and people believe it, but they shouldn't.
Jim Rickards has explained the current predicament that we're in. It's the tight money policy because of the high interest rates. This situation is very similar to what we had back in 2008 when Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac got bankrupt because the Fed is raising the interest rates. It's similar to what we have now, where the interest rates is very high and the banks are hesitant to lend money to anybody. So, how the situation will end? Spoiler alert, it's far worse than you thought.
Well, it either ends when, it can end 2 ways. One is something like 2008, but worse, just a generalized global financial crisis where everybody's getting the money out of every bank, either buying treasury bills. Treasury bills at a brokerage firm are pretty safe because it's not about the brokerage firm. Brokerage firms fail all the time, but they have to segregate house funds, proprietary funds, and customer funds. Money market funds, same thing, in the sense that in 2008, the government proved that they're willing to bail out money market funds. And they did, guaranteed every money market fund in the country. So the best safe haven is gold. Let's say physical gold, bullion, coins or bars, and silver. It's not digital. You can't hack it. You can't steal it, and you can't freeze it. They just put it in a safe place. So Americans don't really get gold. They don't really understand it. So yeah, I think it's just going to be a question of frog hopping from lily pad to lily pad, looking for a safe place. The other scenario is that the government just throws in the towel and says, okay, all deposits are guaranteed in unlimited amounts. And I knew people who were trying to get $8 billion out of Silicon Valley Bank on that. They sent the wire instructions on Thursday night. One guy I talked to said, hey, Jim, from Thursday night to Sunday, we didn't know where the money was. We sent the wire instructions. We were trying to get it out, but we didn't know what the outcome was going to be, whether it was short or not, wire sent or not. And then Sunday night, the Fed and the FDIC came out and said, all good. We're going to, business as usual, open Monday, and it's all good. And he said the money went through. But that was what, people were facing, and they'll continue to face. I mean, the banks you mentioned, I don't know what their deposit flows are right now, but my guess is they're shrinking fast. People are getting their money out. And so you might just have to give a generalized blanket deposit insurance protection. And that would stop bank runs in theory, but then now you basically nationalize the U.S. banking system. You look like Argentina. So there are no, I guess the way to put it, Matt, there are no good outcomes. Either there's a catastrophe worse than 2008 that starts to look like 1931, 32, or the government offers so much protection that they've de facto nationalized the banking system. But the one thing I've noticed is that each crisis gets bigger than the one before. And each bailout is bigger than the one before. And the question I'm asking as an analyst is, are we at the point where the crises are so big, it's bigger than the Fed? In other words, we're not really talking about bailing out a bank or a sector. People lose confidence in the dollar itself. And we do seem to be heading in that direction.
Jim Rickards said the crisis will get bigger than the one before. In 1999, Wall Street bailed out the market, and in 2008, the Fed bailed out Wall Street. And now, who will bail out the Fed? Jim proposed the idea of the dollar collapse. People often misunderstand the concept of the end of the dollar as the global reserve currency and as a payment currency. Let's listen to what Jim Rickards has to say.
But I find there's a lot of confusion on the topic. And the confusion comes from the fact that everyone talks about the end of the dollar, the dollar is going away as a global reserve currency, etc. But people don't distinguish between the role of the dollar as a payment currency and the role of the dollar as a reserve currency. And those are two very different things. There's some linkages. But payment currency, basically, if I want to buy goods and services from you, and I tender some form of currency and you're willing to accept it, and you're confident someone else will accept it from you, that's a good payment currency. It could be dollars, it could be euros or yuan, or it could be Russian rubles or Brazilian rice or anything, as long as people are willing to accept it, have confidence in it. A reserve currency is a very different thing. First of all, we don't really have reserve currencies. You go to the People's Bank of China, they don't have $100 bills stacked up in the basement. What they own are U.S. Treasury securities, which are digital, by the way. The last paper Treasury security was issued, I think, around 1979. So what they have are actually securities. So when people say reserve currency, what they really mean is securities that hold your reserves denominated in a currency. So, of course, Treasury securities are denominated in dollars, but they don't have actual dollars, in a bank account or a physical form. They own securities. Now, as far as the payment currency is concerned, that's relatively easy to displace. This is what all the news is about. So the BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they're working on a new payment currency, and that we're likely to see a big rollout of that this coming August. Don't know exactly what it'll be. They're working behind the scenes. It could be commodity backed. It could be gold backed. I'm not predicting that, but that's certainly one of the possibilities that we need to look at. But there is one thing that could knock the dollar off, which is gold. Gold is just gold. If you have physical gold, bullion or coins, you don't need all that other stuff. You just put it in a safe place and guard it, like Fort Knox or whatever the Russians and Chinese have their equivalents, and just sit on it. It's not digital. You can't hack it. You can't freeze it, etc. So if someone said, so the idea of the dollar losing ground as a payment currency is completely plausible. It'll happen in stages. It's happening already. The idea of the dollar losing its role as a reserve currency, it's not going to lose it to another currency, but it could lose it to gold. The Fed, at the height of the pandemic panic, going back to 2020, the Fed's balance sheet was up to about $9 trillion. I had to get used to saying trillion instead of billion, but about $9 trillion. And it's come down a little bit since then, but people say, well, wait a second, how can there be a dollar shortage or a liquidity crisis when the Fed printed $9 trillion? Well, the answer is you have to understand how the money system works and where real money creation comes from, and it does not come from the Fed. And here's why: the Fed did print the money, that's real, but the way they do it, the Fed buys bonds and treasury notes from the primary dealers, from the big banks, and they call up and offer me a 10-year note. Okay, here's the price, done. Goldman Sachs will send the 10-year note to the Fed, and the Fed pays for it with money that comes out of thin air. So that is money printing. It's as simple as that. But then Goldman Sachs, in my example, takes the money and gives it back to the Fed, because the Fed's a bank. They deposit it at the Fed in the form of what they call excess reserves, and the Fed pays interest on excess reserves, so the Goldman's actually making money off it. The point is, the money didn't go anywhere. The Fed did create it out of thin air, that much is true, but the recipient who sold the bonds gives it back to the Fed. It sits on the Fed's balance sheet. So the asset side, you've got all these treasury notes, but the liability side, you've got all these deposits, and it just sits there and it doesn't do anything. So where's the real money that powers the economy? If there is, if it does at all, where does that come from? It comes from the banks, because the banks can do the same thing. When the bank makes you a loan, what do? You're a business, you set up a checking account. They say, okay, here's $1 million loan. They put the $1 million in your checking account. Where'd that money come from? They just said you got the money, right? And so they have an asset, which is a loan from you with note, and they got a liability, which is your deposit. So banks create money kind of the same way the Fed does, except it's supposed to be in private commerce. And that money actually can go somewhere. If you're a business, you got a payroll, you got to buy stuff or invest stuff, et cetera. But there's not much of that going on. Velocity is very low. The turnover of money is low. But the point is that hasn't really been going anywhere. Now, but here's the key. $9 trillion on the balance sheet, maybe, 5-6 trillion today. It's a lot of money. But the notional value of derivatives off balance sheet of the banks is $1 quadrillion. And for listeners who might not have heard the word quadrillion before, 1 quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. So your 9 trillion at the Fed doesn't get you very far if you have to support 1,000 trillion dollars worth of derivatives. And how does that work? Well, the answer is mostly the banks doing off-balance sheet swaps and swaptions and other futures and forwards, and we don't have to go down the whole litany of names, with either each other, because they're trading firms, or with hedge funds who want them for speculation or hedging, or sovereign wealth funds or other institutions. There's a whole network of participants. But these are the big boys. These are the trillion-dollar institutions, the BlackRock and the Temasek and the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway. These are the big players involved in this market. Okay, so you have $1,000 trillion of derivatives off balance sheet. By the way, you will not see this looking at a bank balance sheet. You got to read the footnotes. You got to know what you're looking at. How is that supported? Well, it's supported with collateral. Not 100%, not even close, but maybe 1%, 2%. You got to put up some margin money to be in the game, but then you can have a lot more off balance sheet. Okay, so what's the best form of collateral? Well, it depends. Whether you're in a liquidity crisis or not, whether people are feeling confident or are worried, whether they think things are going to go great or start to collapse. So as things get more difficult, and that's the phase we're in right now, the quality of the collateral has to go up. So the banks are now saying to each other, I don't want your mortgages. I don't want your stupid corporate bonds. I don't even want 10-year treasury notes. Get me bills, treasury bills. These are short-term, very liquid, 1-year maturity or less. A lot of them are 4-week bills, 8-week bills, 6-month bills. These are very short-term, very liquid. They are the best collateral there is. And the banks are saying to each other, that's what I want. Okay, so now you're Barclays Bank or Deutsche Bank or Unicredit, Credit Suisse or bank, some major Japanese bank, etc. Where are you going to get the bills? Well, you got to buy them from a dealer, or you can buy them at auction. The Treasury has auctions, or you can get them from the Fed. But to buy a dollar-denominated Treasury bill, you need dollars. So that's why the dollar is so strong. Everyone's like, hey, Jim, we got these huge budget deficits and $1 trillion of expenses and bailouts and handouts and, 131% debt to GDP ratio, $31 trillion in debt, et cetera. How can the dollar be so strong? Well, the answer is it has nothing to do with everything I just said. The dollar is strong because everybody in the world needs dollars to buy Treasury bills to prop up the balance sheets of the 1 quadrillion of derivatives that nobody can see. And this is real. This is way behind the curtain, Ken. This is real inside baseball in terms of how the international monetary system actually works. So the strength of the dollar, which by the way is a headwind for gold, the euro's down, sterling's down, the Swiss francs are down. Gold hasn't actually gone down a lot. It hasn't gone up a lot, but it's holding its own. But a strong dollar means anything denominated in dollars is going to go down, because if the dollar gets stronger, the dollar price of the commodity gets lower, or at least doesn't go up a lot. Okay, so first of all, you got a mad scramble for dollars. Why? To buy treasury bills. Why? Because they're the only collateral to prop up everything I just described. Now, but there's evidence of this, and again, you have to know where to look. So right now, the Fed has what they call the reverse repo program. What is that? Well, any bank, any major institution that wants treasury bills can call the Fed and say, give me some treasury bills. And you give the Fed cash. It can be overnight or a couple of days or whatever. The Fed pays you interest, so you're making a little money. Then they send you the treasury bills. Well, why isn't that the solution? Why doesn't that work? Well, the answer is you can do that, and you can get those treasury bills, but you cannot rehypothecate them. You cannot pledge them to anybody else. You have to keep them. And the Fed might want to unwind that at any time. Well, that's not good enough, because if I'm supporting some other transaction with somebody else and they're supporting another transaction through a chain of could be 25 banks all in the same, back to back, I want treasury bills that I can pledge to Credit Suisse, so they can pledge to Barclays, so they can pledge to JP Morgan, et cetera. So I got to get treasury bills either at auction from the Treasury, and they're not issuing that many because actually the budget deficit is coming down a little bit, or buy them in the secondary market. Just to put some data behind this, Robert, just to show it's not a theory. So I can, if I'm a bank, I can call up the Fed and get treasury bills, in 15 minutes, and there's a certain price. They're going to pay me interest. I'm going to get a discount and give it back. If I buy it in the treasury market, there's also a price. I got to, they always trade, they mature at par, so you buy them at a discount, and the difference is how much interest you make. Okay. The interest, the yield to maturity on the treasury bill that you buy in the secondary market is lower than what the Fed will give you for free just by picking up the phone. So why would you ever buy a treasury bill in the secondary market with a lower yield than what the Fed will hand you? Well, the answer is because you can rehypothecate it. You're desperate. You're willing to take less yield to get the one that you can pledge, instead of getting a higher yield for the one you can't pledge. So it's all about the rehypothecation. But the point being, the fact that yields on secondary market purchases are lower than what the Fed will give you for free tells you how desperate people are to get those bills.
So that's causing us a liquidity crisis.
That's the beginning of a liquidity crisis.
And that's what you're warning everybody about right now.
Right.
I mean, you want a lot of things.
I spoke to someone recently. I said, well, Jim, I hear you. When's all this coming to a head? And I said, maybe this winter or this spring, sooner than you think. And I based that on the last two super liquidity crises when the world almost completely collapsed, or maybe it did, were 1998, that was long-term capital management Russia, and 2008 during Lehman Brothers. But I remind people, Sunday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy electronically on a Sunday night. And that was like, we all know what happened next. But that crisis started in 2007. Remember August 9th, 2007, Jim Cramer and Aaron Burnett on CNBC, and he's yelling, they know nothing, they know Well, he was right. They didn't know anything. They were idiots, meaning the Fed. But then Hank Paulson and the Super Civ and the sovereign wealth fund bailout, and then Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and so there was a lot leading up to the Lehman Brothers, but it took a year. It took a year to go around. Same thing with long-term capital. It came to a head in September 1998. We were hours away from shutting every financial market in the world. We got the $4 billion in, stabilized the balance sheet, and life went on. But it was a really close call. But that started in June 1997, when Thailand broke the peg to the dollar, started to run on the bank in Thailand. It spread to Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea. You always hear the expression, time to buy is when there's blood in the streets. Well, sadly, there was blood in the streets, real blood in Korea, because people got killed. And then it went to Russia, then long-term capital. But my point is, everyone knows the acute stage, September 98 or September 2008, but it began a year earlier. So now everything we've just been talking about is already happening. It's been happening since last spring. So if you stick to this 1 year rule, and it's not a hard and fast scientific rule, but we've seen two cases where it took a year to come around. If that's your rule, and it started in March 2022, and there's good evidence for that, then kind of March 2023 is your D-Day.
There were $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. These are mortgages that, no documentation, don't have to prove your income, very non-credit worthy. But there was a bubble mentality, a frenzy, and everyone, hey, buy a house and borrow money, fix it up, sell it for twice as much, walk away rich, and everybody was doing it. Mortgage default rates rarely get above 5%. 5% is really high in the mortgage market. So people were saying, smart people like Ben Stein, the financial analyst, but the central bank and others were like, well, okay, let's get crazy. Let's assume a 20% default rate, which has never happened, but just assume that's true. On $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, a 20% default rate would be a $200 billion loss, which was only slightly higher than the S&L crisis of the 1980s. Adjusted for inflation, it would have been a comparable loss. And the attitude was, well, we survived the 80s, we'll survive this. Yeah, it's bad, banks will take losses, stock prices go down a little bit, but we'll survive. What they missed is, yes, there was $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, but there were $6 trillion of derivatives.
Yeah.
That was invisible. So all of a sudden, 20% of that was $1.2 trillion. So you create derivatives out of thin air, and there's no limit on how many you can have. They're off balance sheet, meaning give me the balance sheet of the company, I won't see them. You have to read the footnotes and then the information behind the footnotes. So non-transparent, unregulated, no limit on size. So the crisis was actually much worse than anyone realized. And then when it started to collapse, the contagion spread throughout the financial system. My point about 2008, it was because we did not learn the lessons of 1998, and we flew right into 2008. But once again, we have not learned the lessons of 2008, and we're going to fly right into the next storm. In 1998, Wall Street got together and bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks got together and bailed out Wall Street. Who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, the point is each crisis is bigger than the one before. The intervention gets elevated, larger dollar amounts. And are we now at the point where there's no one left to bail us out? And one of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, okay, Jim, I kind of follow your analysis on how risk works and how complexity theory and capital markets, how that works. But where's the crisis coming from? What's going to be the catalyst? It's actually a long list. Now, student loans, there are $1.6 trillion worth of student loans. So this will go, and kind of this gets to your point, Francis, how do capital markets and money markets and Fed policy kind of leach into debt and deficits? So when a lender, credit union, or anybody, or university makes a loan to a student, and the Treasury guarantees that loan, which they do, it's off budget. Again, it's not strictly a derivative, but it is non-transparent. So then the student defaults, and the credit union, the lender, simply turns to the Treasury and said, here's your loan file, pay me. And the Treasury pays the lender because they've guaranteed the loan. Now it's on the Treasury. But until that point, that loss is not on the books of the United States government. That loss is not part of the deficit. But when the Treasury writes the check to make good on the guarantee, it does go into the deficit. So we think deficits are high now, but there's this $1 trillion tsunami of student loan losses that's going to pile on top of the structural deficits and make it even worse. So all these things are, I spend all my time analyzing these things. I see them all. I can describe them. I can see how they're going to converge into a worse crisis. But in the short run, people either ignore them or they just don't know anything about them. But why would Bernie Sanders even suggest that? And by the way, he's not alone. I think the other candidates have, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, one way or another, have suggested that they would do something similar, that we need student loan relief, and that ends up going onto the budget and onto the taxpayers. But there's a school of economics, and I talked about this in chapter 5 of my book. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT for short. Everyday viewers, everyday people to know anything about it, but more to the point, economists don't know anything about it. This is a new school of economics, if you want to think of it that way. So there is this modern monetary theory, but the leading scholar of modern monetary theory is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor at the State University of New York. but she's the financial advisor to Bernie Sanders. What modern monetary theory says is that actually there's no limit on the amount you can spend. You can spend as much as you want, and the market will either buy the debt, or if they balk, the Fed will monetize the debt. So how much debt is there relative to the size of the economy? This is called the debt to GDP ratio, but the way it's a simple fraction you learn in the 5th grade. How much debt divided by the size of the economy? So in a simple example, if you had $5 trillion of debt and a $10 trillion economy, that fraction would be 1/2. So you would say the debt to GDP ratio is 1/2 or 50%. Today, the debt is larger than the economy. That ratio is over 100%. We had round numbers, about $23 trillion of debt and about a $22 trillion economy. So the ratio is about 105%, highest since World War II. That troubles me. It troubles other economists. But my friend Stephanie says, what's the problem? You could take it to 150%, 200%. 250%. By the way, that's where Japan is. Japan's at 250%. Greece is 175% or so. Italy's 135%. They're all still standing. If you go to the Ginza, it looks like Times Square. So you don't see visible signs of stress. And here's the irony. Ben Bernanke would absolutely not agree with this theory, and he said so publicly. But Professor Kelton says to Bernanke, you proved our point. You were the one who took the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupled it from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion or so. You proved that you can print trillions of dollars of money without causing inflation, without causing high interest rates, without causing a run on the bank. So all we're saying is, you did it to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus. We wanted to do it to forgive student loans. We may have different policy objectives, but the process is the same. What's the problem? Now, of all the things I've debated, for years I was dragged into Bitcoin versus gold debates, which I thought were silly. I mean, I don't like Bitcoin. I do like gold, but it's like fish versus bicycles. I mean, the debate never made sense to me, even though I did a lot of them. Of all the things I've had to rebut, this was actually the most difficult because it's superficially appealing. First of all, legally, it is true that the Fed can take their balance sheet as high as they want. There's no legal limit on the Fed's ability to print money. It is true that Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, and they're still standing. It is true that the Treasury can borrow as much as they want, subject to periodic increases in the debt ceiling, which have never been denied. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So all the elements of the thesis are actually correct. So how do you refute it? And the answer is that legally it can be done. And if your goal is to print a lot of money and forgive student loans or give a guaranteed job or guaranteed basic income, whatever it is, in theory you could do that. But there is an invisible psychological boundary, and this is what the modern monetary theorists don't understand, and I don't think Ben Bernanke understands it. There comes a time when people wake up and they say, I don't know what's going on here. I don't have a PhD, but get me out of the dollar. It doesn't. And so I'll buy gold. I'll buy silver, land, oil, natural resources. Buy a new car. Buy a house. Get me out of the dollar into something tangible, because I no longer trust the monetary authorities. I no longer trust the Congress. I can't believe that you're going to spend this much money without ceiling, without limit, without causing inflation. My inflationary expectations will go up. And the way to deal with that is to buy hard assets, starting with gold, but not exclusively gold. There, as I say, land, real estate, natural resources. They're all good. They're all good substitutes. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket. All of a sudden, the bond market will have difficulty selling it. The president of the Congress could take away some of the Fed's independence. All of these assumptions could come crashing down very quickly, very unexpectedly, and that's the problem with the theory.
दोस्तों इस वीडियो में मैं आपको वीडियो किस तरह से वीडियो जूम करते हैं और जूम आउट करते हैं। दोस्तों आपने कई जगह देखा होगा जिसमें आपने वीडियो को जूम इन और जूम आउट करके देखा होगा किसी की वीडियो में, तो वो बहुत ही आसान तरीका है। अगर आप इस वीडियो को पूरा देखेंगे तो आपको बहुत ही अच्छे तरीके से समझ आ जाएगी और आप बहुत ही अच्छे तरीके से किसी भी वीडियो को जूम आउट या जूम इन करना सीख जाओगे। इसके लिए आपको वीडियो पूरी देखनी पड़ेगी, तभी आपको समझ आएगी। और अगर वीडियो आपको अच्छी लगे तो आपने वीडियो को लाइक कर देना है और कमेंट में बताना कि और इस टॉपिक से रिलेटेड आपको कौन सी वीडियो चाहिए। तो मैं आपको पूरी कोशिश करूँगा समझाने की वीडियो को किस तरह से जूम इन या जूम आउट किया जाता है। तो आपने इस चैनल पर आपने इस वीडियो पर बने रहना है ताकि आपको वीडियो की पूरी समझ आ सके। चलते हैं वीडियो की तरफ। मैं आपको वीडियो जूम इन और जूम आउट करना सिखाऊंगा, तो आप अपने अच्छे तरीके से बने रहना है। और काइन मास्टर में आपको इतने अच्छे तरीके से समझाऊंगा कि आपको कोई भी ये नहीं सिखा पाए। दोस्तों इसके लिए आपको मीडिया में जाना है, अपने फाइल सेलेक्ट करनी है जो आपको जिसमें आपको वो करना है, ये इस पर सेलेक्ट करना है। उसके बाद दोस्तों जो वीडियो आपको जूम इन या जूम आउट चाहिए करनी है वो वीडियो करनी है। जैसे कि दोस्तों मैं ये वीडियो करना चाहता हूँ, ये दोस्तों वीडियो मैंने ले ली। अब दोस्तों इस वीडियो को मैं जूम करना चाहता हूँ, तो मैं किस तरह से करूँगा। सबसे पहले आपको क्या करना है, इस वीडियो को सिलेक्ट करना है। सिलेक्ट कर लिया, उसके बाद दोस्तों क्या करना है, उसके बाद आपको दोस्तों इस तरह से करना है, ये बीच वाले में लगाना है दोस्तों। इसमें ये दोस्तों अब गौर से देखते जाना है ताकि आपको इस पर दोस्तों आपने क्लिक करना है। क्लिक करने के बाद दोस्तों आपने क्या करना है, अब आपको जूम इन अगर करनी है दोस्तों, आपको कोई पार्ट करना है या जो भी करना है आपको जूम करने के लिए दोस्तों ऊपर वाले को लगाना होगा। जो भी आपको करना है, ये पार्ट ले लिया, उसके बाद आपने इधर कट लगा लेना है। अब जो ऐसा आपको चाहिए, सॉरी आपको कार्ड लगाना भी सिखा दे जो आपको ऐसा चाहिए दोस्तों। इसके लिए अगर आपको स्पेसिफिक हिस्सा चाहिए जिससे आपने वो लगाना है, जूम इन या जूम आउट करना है, उसके लिए आपको क्या करना होगा, आपने इसके लिए वीडियो को सिलेक्ट करना होगा। ठीक है, अब कोई सा भी पार्ट ले ले, मिसाल के तौर पर मैं ये वाला पार्ट ले लूँ, तो उसको अपने काट देना है। मिसाल के तौर पर इस पर आपने लगा देना है, इस पर दोस्तों। ठीक है दोस्तों, इस पर लगा देना है और अब बीच में से आपने काट देना। अब जो आपको चाहिए फिर आपने वहीं पर जाना, अब स्पेसिफिक हिस्सा जो आपको चाहिए। ठीक है, अब यानी कि मैंने ये ले लिया, अब इसको जूम इन करना है, यानी कि आपको करीब करना है दोस्तों। आप वीडियो को बहुत ज़्यादा करीब करो, तो आपने ऊपर वाले को सिलेक्ट करना है और वीडियो को यहाँ से जितना अंदर तक लेना चाहते हैं दोस्तों, यहाँ से यहाँ पर दोस्तों आपने करना है, इस जगह पर दोस्तों आपने जूम इन या जूम आउट करना है। ठीक है दोस्तों, अब आपने जूम इन करना है, पहले दोस्तों ऊपर वाले पर क्लिक करके इस पर क्लिक करके ये इस पर दोस्तों क्लिक करके ये ऊपर वाले पर ठीक है ना, इस पर क्लिक करना है। फिर वीडियो पर आना है और वीडियो को जूम इन जितना भी दोस्तों आप करना चाहो, जितना भी करना चाहो, अब मैं जितना भी करना चाहूँ, जितना भी दोस्तों आप करना चाहो आप करते जाओगे। ठीक है दोस्तों, अगर आपको इसी तरह से जूम ही रखना है तो दोस्तों आपने ये लगा रहा है तो आपने इस ऑप्शन पर क्लिक करना है, इस ऑप्शन पर दोस्तों ये राइट रहा जो इस पर मैं कहना चाह रहा हूँ। तो दोस्तों इस पर आपने क्लिक करना है, ये इस तरह से ऊपर आपने टिक कर देना है, तो यह जूम इन हो गया। अब वीडियो को प्ले करता हूँ, देखा दोस्तों आपने किस तरह से जूम ऐसा किया। अब जूम आउट दोस्तों अगर आपने करना है, अब कोई चीज़ अगर बहुत ज़्यादा जूम आउट कैसे करेंगे, अपने वीडियो पर सेलेक्ट करना है, फिर ऊपर बीच में ऑप्शन पर क्लिक करना है दोस्तों, इस पर, और नीचे वाले ऑप्शन पर क्लिक करना है। अब नीचे वाले पर क्लिक करना है, वीडियो को जूम आउट ऊपर वीडियो पर क्लिक करना है, ऊपर पूरा कर देना है और इस तरह से जूम आउट भी हो जाएगी। अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छी लगी है तो सब्सक्राइब कर देना है और वीडियो को लाइक कर देना है और आपने बताना है कि आपको किस तरह की और टॉपिक पर वीडियो चाहिए। शुक्रिया।
Kemana lah HP Mima itu hilang, ha? Hah? Gak tahu, carilah HP-nya, hilang-hilang terus loh. Piranto hilang, ini hilang. Di mana Mima terakhir pakai HP-nya? Hah?
Nggak tahu. Lupa.
Mak, nggak dapat loh HP-nya ini loh, Mak. HP Bima itu. Nggak nampak tadi mana taruhnya.